Welcome to the Sleep API preview for Nengi. The Sleep API is a large performance enhancement for entities. Entities in Nengi are the most used feature because you can get a lot of functionality with very little coding. By declaring something as an entity in Nengi, you can have it automatically networked between everybody who can see it, and all you had to do was define which properties in it are to be networked and add it to the game instance. That's how this game here is made. I have got this entity, its X, Y, hit points, and rotation are networked. And these green trees are just a position and hit points. There's never any code that says, oh, send the hit points, send the position, send anything in specific. It's just they're automatically networked after their protocols are defined. Now, it can be tempting, because of this, to try and make just about anything you want networked an entity when you're using Nengi. But some things aren't a good fit. Essentially, objects that spend most of their time static, not moving, not changing, are overkill. Well, an entity is overkill for them. The entity works by being scanned for changes every frame, and if we were to make, for example, a tile map or a giant world, and we were to make literally every tile, every tree, every rock an entity, and just leave it like that, Nengi is going to be scanning them for changes all the time, and we're going to eat at CPU for something that couldn't ever even possibly happen. The sleepy entity features allow us to say that certain entities are essentially static and unchanging, and thus Nengi can go ahead and skip over them for performance reasons. There's some enhancements and specifics to the API that allow us to use them on things that do change periodically, and I'll show some of those right now, actually. But let's look at the API real quick. The API is very simple for sleep. It's essentially sleep, wake, and wake once. Sleep does what you'd think. The entity is no longer scanned for changes every frame. Wake restores it to its normal state. Every entity by default in Nengi is awake, unless you tell it to sleep. Wake once is a special function. Wake once wakes an entity for one frame. You use this when you have an entity that's essentially static, but your code that interacts with it changes it, and you say, okay, well, why don't you wake up for one frame? Because this is the only time you really change. Example of that are these little green circles, which when I shoot them, I wake them for one frame so we can see their hit points change. But the whole rest of the time, they're behaving as a sleeping entity, and their performance is pretty well optimized. So, how good is the performance from this? Well, it varies a lot depending on what the game's like, how many players are in it, how many of these entities are going to be around. So I'm going to make a test where we're just going to fill the screen with entities, and we're going to look at the profiler and see what they're like when they're awake and what they're like when they're asleep. So I'm going to give us, let's see, 5,000 entities that cannot sleep. They're just stuck in the wake state, which is a lot, mind you, right? You probably weren't thinking I was going to pick 5,000. 5,000 is in fact too many to render. The renderer itself will lag, even though the Nengi server is okay with this. So let's open a profiler and see what is happening on the server while they are all stuck in the wake state. At this moment, Nengi is scanning them every frame to see if their X, Y, or hit points have changed, which they're not changing. Let's see how expensive that is. So I'm collecting maybe 5-ish seconds of profile here. The program rang in here at essentially 40% idle, 48% idle, sorry. And let me just drill down into these little Nengi internal functions. We'll stop when I see update. So update here is at, let's call it 37%. So 37% of the time was spent in update, and I can tell you this game's got nothing else happening other than this little serialization evaluation phase. Let's see what it's like when it's sleeping. So same thing, 5,000 entities, but this time they're all asleep. Mind you, the code still exists that wakes them right when they get shot, but they're only woken for one frame. Pretty awesome performance. Reconnecting to that. Looks the same. I mean, their positions are random, but you know, there's so many of them, they pretty much fill in the square. And as you can see, I can shoot. They do wake up just to take damage. All right, so gonna need new profiler connection because it's a new process. Giving it 5-ish seconds again. So this program, just right off the bat, 77% idle. When I drill down till I find that update function, I don't even remember what the other one was already, but this one's 13%. Having run this a few times, I can tell you that it varies a bit depending on the game, but this is on the order of 2 to 3 times faster. And it's not 2 to 3 times faster in an arbitrary spot, it's 2 to 3 times faster in the very specific multiplayer, choke point of having too many entities. So it's a massive speed up right where it matters if you can use sleepy entities to make features. And there's plenty of things that could pretty much always be sleepy entities, like trees and mining nodes or items that are sitting on the ground. These things are essentially a position and a type. They're not something that every frame experiences changes. And when they change is also quite predictable. For example, in this code here, I know that the only time I have to call wake once on an entity is when the collision code that does a little laser that shoots decides that it's collided. That's the only time it experiences a change. So it was easy to leave it in the sleepy performance state and wake it once on the only time it has to change. How many will you really get in a game? I mean, varies wildly, but I've made a few prototypes that have up to 100 players and a few thousand entities that are sleepy or sleeping, and that's as opposed to previous versions that had no feature of the kind, which were just pretty much hard limited at kind of low or mid hundreds of entities, with no concept of them being in different modes. So I hope people get some use out of this, and thanks for watching.